Hello and welcome to Pacific Dialogue. I'm your host Wenhan. 2026 is the 55th anniversary of the Ping-Pong Diplomacy, a breakthrough in which a simple sporting exchange helped reopen dialogue, ease Cold War tensions, and paved the way for normalized relations between China and the United States. Joining us is Connie Sweeris, a former US table tennis player who took part in those historic exchanges in the early 1970s, and who has remained connected with China and its people for more than 5 decades. Hi, Mr. Connie Sweeris. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And can you briefly introduce yourself and tell us how did you choose table tennis as your career?
I'm Connie Sweeris, and I was part of the U.S. table tennis team that went to Nagoya, Japan to play in the World Table Tennis Championships. And then from there we went into China to play the friendship matches. I started playing table tennis when I was about 9 or 9 and a half. And I won my first tournament at age 10 in Chicago, Illinois. We just didn't have any coaches back then. So we had to learn by watching other good players play and getting books from the library and trying to figure out a good technique of how to hit forehand and backhand. When I was that age and was over in Japan for the World Championships, obviously, I would want to go to China to play with the #1 players in the world and maybe learn some techniques and training from them. But we had no idea that we were going to be invited into China in 1971.
In 1971, there was a story that American athletes got on the wrong bus.
Yeah, he was a teammate of ours, Glenn Cowan, and he overstayed the practicing hall. So when he came out of the practice hall, he stepped on the first bus that he thought was going back to the hotel, and it was the Chinese bus.
Yes.
And he met Zhuang Zitong. He came forward and greeted Glenn. And they really couldn't communicate, but Zhuang Zitong gave him a picture of the mountains in China, and Glenn accepted it. It was probably the last day of the competition that the Chinese delegation, table tennis delegation, extended an invitation for the American players to come into China. And so we had to get permission from our government in Washington, D.C. to be able to go into China. And they gave us permission, but in our passports it said that you could not enter a communist-controlled country. And it named China, Vietnam, Albania. There were several countries. So we had to take our passports to the embassy in Japan, American embassy, and they just took our passports and crossed out with a black permanent marker China, so that it allowed us to go ahead and go into China.
What was your first reaction when you know that?
My first reaction was I was a little nervous, but excited, because I thought, oh, we're going to get to be able to play against the Chinese, who usually are ranked #1 in the world in the sport that I love to play. We played a friendship match in Capitol Stadium here in Beijing, and that was a real thrill for me because there was 18,000 people in the stadium to watch us play. And in the United States at that time, table tennis isn't that popular, so we'd be lucky at a national championship to have 300 people watching us. So to play before a crowd of 18,000, that was really something. And then we also met Premier Zhou Enlai at the Great Hall of the People. And I personally got to shake hands with him. And he said we could ask him any questions or make comments.
Did you ask questions?
I did not, but he asked a question of our president, Graham Steenhoven, who was with us, of the United States Table Tennis Association. And he asked Graham, he said, "Do you have any criticism of your trip so far?" And Graham said yes. And everybody thought, oh boy, what is he going to say? And he said, "You feed us too much." And everybody laughed because we were always having these 8 to 10 course banquet meals and getting all of the delicacies, that China has in food. We had training session one-on-one with another Chinese player, and she taught us a few techniques that they do when they train for a tournament. But the problem was sometimes in the big groups when we were all together, we didn't have enough interpreters to just speak, always one-on-one.
Yeah. So how to communicate?
It was difficult. You hand signals and, smiling and just body language, a lot of times. We tried to interact as much as we could with them. But I think the big thing with ping-pong diplomacy is that it opened up the door for communication. Even though we had been separated as countries for over 22 years, this was a chance to really begin speaking with one another and begin communicating. And then President Nixon went in, and Chairman Mao and Nixon signed a communique, and a few years later, diplomatic ties were established. But we didn't have any idea that it would become such a historical event, and that all these anniversaries keeps it alive.
Yeah, it takes some time to see how big impact it played. It's such a small ball to
move the big ball.
Yeah, the small ball moved the big ball. What do you think sports role in bridging the relationship between the two countries?
And I think having these face-to-face exchanges, you create dialogue with one another. It breaks down barriers. It promotes understanding between cultures and people. So I think sports can definitely play a part in bridging the gap.
You've come to China 5 times. What changed and what remained the same?
When I came in '71, everybody was riding bicycles and getting around on foot. And today, of course, it's modern and everybody has cars here in Beijing and Shanghai. And also the buildings and the skyscrapers that you now have. Compared to when we went in. And what I think is amazing and impressing me is how Beijing, anyway, has created all these modern buildings, but yet within the city, you still have some of the old ancient structures, the old buildings that show the architecture of that day. And so I think that's really neat.
Are you optimistic towards the future of China-U.S. relations?
Yes, I think, in any relationship, if you compare it to a marriage sometimes, you're going to have the high points and you're going to have some low points. You're never going to agree totally 100%. And so you're going to have some ups and downs. But through communication, hopefully you can begin to understand each other's cultures and keep communicating and work out those problems. And that's what my hope is. Because if we do, we'll begin to have maybe, hopefully, global peace, where if we begin to try to understand one another. And my hope is that the younger generation today will carry the ping-pong diplomacy legacy forward.
It is happening.
Yes, it is. But I hope it continues to do so that our two countries can get more on an even keel.